There comes a moment, quiet, unassuming, when the soul grows tired of being second, not just in relationships, not just at work, but in the entire structure of how you've learned to exist. You catch yourself smiling for someone else's comfort, saying yes when your entire body wants to scream no, bending into shapes you don't recognize just to be acceptable. And in that moment, a voice whispers, maybe faintly, maybe urgently, "What would happen if I chose me?" It's a dangerous question, not because it's wrong, but because it threatens the very fabric of the life you were taught to live. Carl Jung once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But what he didn't say, at least not directly, is that this privilege comes at a cost. And that cost is everything you built from the persona you wear. To be loved, praised, or needed. This video is not about selfishness. It's about survival of your soul, your energy, your truth. It's about what happens when you stop betraying yourself in the name of being good. From the moment we're born, we are subtly and often overtly conditioned to believe that goodness equals selflessness. Be a good boy. Be a nice girl. Don't be selfish. These phrases, though seemingly harmless, form the foundation of a belief system that punishes self-prioritization. To put yourself first is to violate an invisible moral code that society upholds, a code that says sacrifice is virtue and self-abandonment is love. This is not just cultural, it's ancestral. Generations pass down the idea that to be worthy of belonging, you must serve others first, and if anything remains, maybe then you can think about yourself. But in this equation, nothing is ever left. You are trained to pour and pour until your own vessel is empty, and even then, you're told to keep giving. Over time, this distortion gets internalized. You start to equate your value with how much you can endure, how much of yourself you can give away, how invisible you can become in the name of keeping peace. The real danger in this conditioning isn't just external, it's what it does to your inner compass. You begin to feel guilt when choosing yourself, shame when asserting a boundary, anxiety when your needs come before someone else's. And so, you start to contort. You perform politeness instead of honesty. You say yes to things that drain your soul. You convince yourself that being needed is the same as being loved. Carl Jung spoke often of the conflict between the individual and the collective, and this is where it lives, in the war between your truth and the roles you were taught to play. You become a character in a story someone else wrote for you, and the deeper you go, the harder it becomes to find your way back to the person you truly are. And the saddest part? Most people never notice. They just applaud your sacrifices, praise your strength, and silently benefit from your silence. This collective reward system for self-abandonment is deeply manipulative. When you serve others at your own expense, you're seen as mature, reliable, even admirable. But when you start to serve yourself, to say no, to rest, to prioritize, your well-being, suddenly the narrative shifts. You're selfish, difficult, ungrateful. This isn't accidental, it's structural. The system benefits when people stay in roles that drain them. Workplaces function more smoothly when no one speaks up. Families stay peaceful when someone takes on the emotional labor. Relationships feel stable, not because they're healthy, but because someone is constantly compromising to maintain. The illusion. And so, we begin to internalize that putting ourselves first is a threat, not just to our identity, but to the entire system around us. To choose yourself is to disrupt the script. And most of us are terrified of what happens when we stop playing the part. But what Jung understood, and what most people never explore, is that the path to wholeness requires a betrayal of these inherited roles. To individuate, in Jungian terms, is to step outside of the expectations society has placed upon you and into the truth of who you really are. And that truth often begins where rebellion starts, by putting yourself first. This doesn't mean living in isolation or rejecting all responsibility. It means refusing to sacrifice your inner world for the approval of the outer one. It means acknowledging that you have needs, desires, and limits, and that honoring them isn't just acceptable, it's essential. Until you break from the conditioning that demonizes your selfhood, you will always live in fragments, always exhausted, always trying to earn your right to rest. But the moment you reclaim your right to prioritize yourself, something shifts. You don't become selfish, you become sovereign. Carl Jung described the persona as the social mask we wear, the version of ourselves we create to be accepted by the world. At first glance, this mask seems harmless. We all adjust our behavior depending on where we are, at work, with friends, with family. But over time, the persona begins to replace authenticity. We forget that we ever had a self beneath the mask. For those conditioned to never put themselves first, the persona becomes an escape, a way to gain love through performance. You become the reliable one, the strong one, the one who never complains. And the more people praise this version of you, the more deeply you entrench yourself in the performance. But what the world applauds is not your truth. It's your usefulness. You are loved not for your essence, but for the function you serve. And slowly, the mask becomes suffocating. The persona is seductive because it works. It gets approval. It helps you survive. But it also disconnects you from the self. When you only show the parts of you that are pleasing, productive, or perfect, you begin to abandon your depth. You hide your sadness, your anger, your neediness, not because they're bad, but because they threaten the mask. In Jungian terms, these hidden parts become the shadow. The more you repress, the more fragmented you become. And while the persona can offer temporary safety, it creates long-term imprisonment. You find yourself performing in every room, adjusting like a chameleon, terrified that if someone saw the full truth of you, they'd walk away. But the tragedy is, no one truly sees you anyway. They only see the role, and as long as you live for approval, the real you remains in exile. Living inside the persona creates a chronic inner tension. There's always a gap between who you are and who you feel you have to be. This gap manifests as anxiety, burnout, emotional numbness, and often depression. You wake up one day and realize you've built an entire life around being what others need, instead of becoming who you truly are. Jung warned that identification with the persona leads to spiritual death. Why? Because it silences the soul. The authentic self, with its contradictions, wildness, and flaws, gets buried under layers of adaptation. And yet, this is the part of you that carries purpose, power, and life force. You may be praised for how well you play your part, but deep down, you know something is missing. Not because your life is empty, but because you are not fully in it. To put yourself first means dismantling the persona, and that's terrifying. Because who are you without the approval? Who are you without the role? Most people never dare to ask, but Jung's path of individuation demands this reckoning. It asks you to step out of the spotlight, away from applause, and into the dim, private corridors of your real self. This process isn't glamorous. It often involves grief, mourning the years spent performing, mourning the love that was given to your mask instead of your essence. But it also brings something holy, liberation. When you stop living for approval, you start living from alignment. You may lose people, you may disappoint others, but what you gain is something no mask can offer. The quiet, steady presence of a self who no longer needs to perform in order to belong. Beneath the noise of obligations, roles, and expectations, there is a voice, one that has been trying to reach you for years. It's quiet, not because it's weak, but because you've been taught to silence it. This is the voice of your true self, the self that existed before you were told who to be. As Jung would put it, this is the self that calls from the depths of the unconscious, not your ego, not your mask, but the part of you that remembers your wholeness. But the modern world doesn't reward this voice. In fact, it punishes it. We're trained to ignore intuition in favor of logic, to dismiss inner knowing in favor of external validation. And so, the inner voice becomes faint. Not gone. Never. Gone, but buried. It waits patiently beneath the layers of people-pleasing, perfectionism, and productivity, hoping one day you will remember how to listen. You may hear this voice in the quietest moments, in the stillness before sleep, or during a walk when no one is watching. It whispers truths that contradict everything your persona tries to uphold. It says, "You're tired. You don't want this. You're pretending." But instead of listening, we distract ourselves. We scroll, we consume, we perform, not because we're shallow, but because we're afraid. Listening to the inner voice means facing uncomfortable truths. It might tell you to leave the job that kills your soul. It might urge you to confront the relationship that keeps you small. It might ask you to rewrite your entire life, not to please others, but to finally meet yourself. That's not a small request. It's a revolution. And revolutions are always met with resistance. The reason we ignore this voice is because it threatens the systems we've built. The life constructed on shoulds begins to crack the moment we prioritize truth. Jung called this the process of individuation, the lifelong journey of becoming who you truly are. But individuation doesn't happen through thinking alone. It begins with listening. Deep, intentional, uncomfortable listening to the aches, to the longing, to the quiet knowing that you've betrayed yourself. To belong, the inner voice doesn't scream, it invites. But if ignored long enough, it can morph into symptoms: anxiety, fatigue, depression, even illness. These are not always pathological. Sometimes they are messages, signals from the psyche that something within you is dying from silence. And healing doesn't mean silencing the pain. It means listening to what the pain is trying to say. Reconnecting with this voice is the first step toward putting yourself first, not in ego, but in essence. To listen is to return. Return to the place inside you that was never confused, never lost, only muffled by the noise of survival. This voice does not shout for attention. It waits to be chosen. And once you do, everything begins to shift. Life stops feeling like a performance and starts feeling like a conversation between soul and world. Decisions feel different. Relationships feel different. Your body even feels different, lighter, clearer, more aligned. Because for the first time, you're not living against yourself. You're not translating your truth to make it digestible for others. You're honoring it as sacred. And from that place, true confidence arises, not the kind built on image, but the kind built on integration. When you listen to the voice within, you become the authority of your own life. Resentment rarely begins with anger. It begins with silence. It builds slowly, invisibly, like a slow leak in the soul. You say yes when you mean no. You offer help when you're already exhausted. You smile when you're breaking inside. And the world claps for it. It calls you strong, kind, selfless. But inside, something sours. Carl Jung warned us that what we repress doesn't disappear. It festers. When we consistently neglect our own needs in the name of love, service, or harmony, we disconnect from the self. We turn away from our own center to orbit around the needs of others. And each act of self-betrayal doesn't just disappear. It collects in the shadow. Eventually, the weight of these sacrifices becomes too heavy to carry with grace. And what once looked like virtue begins to feel like a cage. Resentment is your psyche's protest against a life lived for others. It's not bitterness for the sake of drama. It's a survival signal. It means a boundary has been crossed too many times. It means the inner voice we've silenced is now screaming through the body. headaches, fatigue, irritability, emotional numbness. These are the symptoms of suppressed truth. And the most painful part, often the people around you have no idea. You've been so good at pretending, at performing the caretaker, that they believe you have no limits. They come to expect your sacrifice, and the more you give, the more they take. Not because they are cruel, but because you never taught them where your line was. Self-neglect teaches others that your needs are optional, that your time, energy, and presence come without cost. And so, resentment becomes a form of self-awareness, a signal that you've been invisible in your own life. Jung believed that wholeness comes not from perfection, but from the integration of opposites. That means honoring both your generosity and your limits, your compassion and your rage. When resentment arises, it's not a moral failure. It's a mirror, a reflection of all the times you abandoned yourself in order to be accepted, loved, or seen as good. But true goodness cannot be built on a foundation of self-erasure. The unconscious knows. It remembers every time you swallowed your truth to keep the peace. Every time you said, "It's fine," when it absolutely wasn't. And eventually it demands reconciliation. Resentment is the doorway, not to vengeance, but to boundaries. To stop the cycle of resentment, you must reclaim the parts of you that got lost in the performance. That means learning to say no without guilt. It means disappointing people who benefit from your silence. It means no longer calling it love when it's actually obligation. Jung called this process the return to the self, the movement inward toward wholeness. It's not easy. The guilt will come, the doubt will come, but so will the peace. Because when you stop betraying yourself, your body begins to relax. Your heart opens not from duty, but from truth. And you realize that real love, the kind that nourishes, not depletes, can only grow where honesty lives. Resentment is not your enemy, it's your teacher. And if you listen, it will guide you back to the life you were meant to live. One where your needs are not an afterthought, but a sacred priority. Putting yourself first sounds like a sin in a world that worships self-sacrifice. You've been taught to believe that love means giving until you're empty, that being a good person means being available, agreeable, and accommodating. But beneath that conditioning lies a deeper truth. You cannot pour from an empty cup. Carl Jung taught that the parts of ourselves we suppress don't vanish. They hide in the unconscious, growing in power. When you continually suppress your own needs in favor of others, you exile vital parts of yourself. Your desires, your instincts, your authentic impulses, all pushed into the shadow. And the longer they remain buried, the more distorted they become. What we call selfishness is often the psyche's desperate cry for balance. Reclaiming yourself isn't cruelty, it's healing. Shadow work is not just about confronting darkness, it's about rescuing light that's been banished. The part of you that wants rest, space, truth, that part has been demonized. You've been taught to fear your own needs, but how can you fully love others if you abandon yourself? Jung believed the self is a unifying force, a psychological center that must integrate all opposites, light and dark, selfishness and sacrifice, independence and connection. When you prioritize yourself, you're not turning your back on others, you're turning toward the self. And the self knows what's sustainable. It knows that martyrdom isn't nobility, it's a slow death. Choosing yourself is a revolutionary act in a culture that profits from your exhaustion. It's not ego, it's evolution, and yet the guilt comes like clockwork. You say no and feel selfish. You set a boundary and feel cruel. This is the echo of conditioning, not truth. Guilt, in this context, is not a moral compass. It's a residue of past programming. You've been praised for self-abandonment for so long that self-respect feels wrong. But here's the paradox. The more you ignore your needs, the more resentful and distant you become. The more you shrink, the more disconnected you feel. Putting yourself first is not about stepping on others, it's about standing in your truth. And your truth is not negotiable. It is the foundation of any real relationship, including the one with yourself. The inner work begins when you realize that your well-being is not a luxury, it's a requirement for love, creativity, and peace. Putting yourself first is the ultimate shadow work because it dismantles the illusion that love must cost you everything. It forces you to confront the part of you that fears rejection, abandonment, and judgment. It demands that you say, "I matter," even when your inner critic screams otherwise. Jung didn't ask us to be perfect, he asked us to be whole. And wholeness means honoring the parts of you that were never given permission to speak, rest, or breathe. When you put yourself first, you're not becoming selfish, you're becoming integrated. You're choosing to walk through the discomfort of growth rather than stay trapped in the comfort of dysfunction. And slowly, your life begins to reflect your truth. Not the version of you others want, but the self that was waiting all along to be chosen by you. What happens when you finally stop pretending? When you release the masks, the roles, the exhausting performance of being who others need you to be? That's where the liberation begins, not in rebellion, but in returning. The return to your authentic self is one of the most sacred and terrifying journeys you'll ever take. Carl Jung taught that authenticity isn't simply about doing what you want. It's about aligning with your inner truth. And that truth has been buried beneath years of adaptation. You became who you needed to be in order to survive. You learned what was acceptable, what got love, what kept you safe. But now those survival strategies are chains. They no longer protect you. They imprison you. Liberation begins with the question, who was I before I was told who to be? And, more importantly, am I ready to become that person again? Authenticity isn't loud, it's not dramatic. Often it whispers at first. In your fatigue, your frustration, your longing, it shows up in your discomfort with fake smiles, your irritation with shallow conversations, your craving for solitude, silence, or deeper meaning. The authentic self doesn't shout, it waits, and in Jungian terms, that self exists as the center of the psyche, the self with a capital S, the wholeness that calls us inward. When you feel the pull to reclaim your truth, you're answering that inner summons. But liberation demands loss. You will lose relationships built on your compliance. You will lose admiration rooted in your silence. But what you gain is irreplaceable, inner congruence. You stop living split in two, one self for the world, another in hiding. That fracture heals, and the result is peace, not performance. So why don't more people live from their truth? Because authenticity costs. It costs the illusion of control. It costs the comfort of approval. It requires walking away from the familiar, even when the familiar is killing you slowly. And for many, that fear of being alone outweighs the promise of freedom. But Jung reminds us, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Not the echo of your parents' expectations, not the product of cultural programming, but a soul in alignment. The moment you begin honoring your inner truth, you're reborn, not into a new person, but into your original essence. That's the version of you that speaks clearly, sets boundaries without apology, loves without losing itself. The authentic self doesn't seek to be liked, it seeks to be real. And in being real, it finally belongs to itself. True liberation is subtle. It's not fireworks or grand declarations. It's waking up without dread. It's looking in the mirror and recognizing the person staring back. It's no longer rehearsing conversations in your head or shrinking in rooms where your soul used to suffocate. Jung believed that individuation, the process of becoming your full self, was the goal of life. Not perfection, not acceptance, not even happiness, but wholeness. And wholeness comes when you stop betraying your core to maintain a mask. This is what liberation feels like. The quiet joy of no longer needing to lie about who you are. The relief of no longer fighting yourself just to be loved. When you choose the authentic self, life begins to open. Not because everything gets easier, but because you're no longer resisting your own truth. And that is where freedom lives. There's a particular kind of grief that comes not from being alone, but from realizing you were never truly seen, even in the relationships that once felt closest. When you begin to reclaim your authenticity, it doesn't just change you, it reveals them. The people who once adored your compliance might begin to resent your clarity. The ones who praised your generosity may recoil when you set a boundary, and suddenly, love that once felt safe feels strained. But this isn't your failure. It's the consequence of growing beyond the role you were cast in. As Jung would say, individuation is not a social process, it's a solitary one. And when you step into your real self, the illusions that held certain connections together begin to dissolve. You are not losing people. You are losing the mask that made you tolerable to them. There's a reason why so many fear authenticity. It disrupts the unspoken contracts that many relationships are built upon. I'll be small if you love me. I'll be quiet if you stay. I'll bend if it means I won't be abandoned. But when you stop bending, something radical happens. You discover who is truly with you, not for the role you play, not for the comfort you provide, but for you. And this, in Jungian terms, is the death of the persona in relationship. The social mask begins to slip and some people panic, not because you're doing something wrong, but because your light reveals their discomfort. Some can't handle your boundaries because they have none. Some resist your truth because it triggers their own denial. But that discomfort is not yours to carry. Your work is to remain whole. It's tempting to shrink again when you feel love slipping away, to soften your voice, to apologize for your needs, to re-enter the old pattern just to keep someone close. But Jung warned against this self-betrayal, because once you've tasted authenticity, returning to the false self is unbearable. That's why some breakups hurt less than the years spent pretending. That's why silence can feel like relief after years of forced connection. Not every relationship can survive your healing. Some were never meant to. They were built on who you had to be, not who you truly are. And when that truth emerges, the structure cracks. This isn't cruelty, I'd say it's clarity. You're not pushing people away. You're allowing reality to speak. And reality always asks, is this love built on truth or transaction? Real connection thrives in truth, not performance. And while the loss of approval, comfort, or familiarity can feel like devastation, it's actually a doorway. When you stop abandoning yourself to keep others, you make room for the kind of relationships that can handle the weight of your soul. Jung believed that wholeness requires sacrifice, not of your truth, but of illusions. The illusion that love means staying silent, that peace means pretending, that safety means self-erasure. As these illusions fall away, so too do the relationships that depended on them. What remains is rare but real, relationships where you don't have to disappear, to be loved, where your boundaries aren't threats, they're respected, where your growth isn't inconvenient, it's celebrated. These are the bonds worth keeping, and you can only find them by first being real, even if it means being alone. The moment you begin to prioritize yourself, anxiety often floods, not because you're doing something wrong, but because your nervous system is conditioned to believe that self-prioritization is danger. For years, maybe even decades, your sense of safety was rooted in being needed, wanted, accepted, at the cost of your own truth. So when you begin to make different choices, when you finally say no, rest instead of overextend, or speak when you'd usually stay silent, a kind of emotional whiplash occurs. Jung taught that every major act of individuation, every step, toward authenticity is accompanied by a confrontation with the shadow. And here, the shadow is fear, the fear of rejection, punishment, abandonment. The anxiety doesn't mean you're on the wrong path. It means you're walking a path you were once told would make you unlovable. Many people confuse anxiety with a warning sign, but sometimes anxiety is just evidence of rewiring. Imagine a child who learns that their needs are too much or their desires selfish. That child grows up believing that prioritizing the self is equivalent to hurting others. So when they finally begin to act in self-honoring ways as an adult, it feels like harm, even when it's healing. This is trauma logic. And Jung would point us to the inner child here, the one frozen in time, still trying to avoid punishment by performing goodness. Self-prioritization then becomes an act of reparenting. It is not rebellion, it is remembrance of your needs, your worth, your boundaries. You are not betraying anyone by putting yourself first. You are simply breaking an ancient pattern. That said, your only value was in self-sacrifice. What makes self-prioritization so psychologically taxing is the invisibility of the shift. People around you may not understand why you suddenly seem different, why you need more space, why you say no more often. You may be labeled cold, distant, selfish, and for someone who was conditioned to be the caregiver, the pleaser, the peacekeeper, these labels can feel like weapons. They strike at the very identity you spent your life constructing. But Jung warned of this. The persona becomes a prison when we cling to it for love. When your sense of worth is tied to being liked, any act of self-honoring becomes a threat to that false identity. The anxiety is not about the action. It's about the imagined loss of love. But real love doesn't require you to suffer. And if someone only loves your sacrifice, it was never love at all. The truth is, self-prioritization is not a finish line. It's a practice, a moment-by-moment return to your center. And every time you choose yourself, even through shaking hands or a racing heart, you teach your body that it is safe to be whole. Jung believed that anxiety often signals the birth of something new, not a warning, a threshold. You are stepping out of survival and into truth. Of course it feels uncertain. Of course it shakes your core. You are disrupting generational conditioning. You are becoming someone your ancestors didn't know was possible. Let the anxiety come. Let it tremble through you, but don't let it dictate your return to the false self. Keep going, because beyond the fear is a life where your worth isn't earned through pain, but honored through presence. Betrayal doesn't always come from others. Sometimes the deepest betrayal is self-inflicted. The quiet moments where you say yes when you meant no, where you smile while dying inside, where you suppress your truth to keep the peace. Over time, this self-abandonment accumulates. Like emotional debt, you begin to feel chronically exhausted, but you don't know why. It's not just physical fatigue, it's psychic depletion. Carl Jung spoke often of psychic energy, the life force that fuels meaning, creativity, and vitality. When you betray yourself consistently, you divert that energy away from your soul's path and into the maintenance of a false identity. Your energy doesn't disappear. It gets tied up in the mask, and nothing is more draining than pretending to be who you're not. Imagine your energy as water. When you're in alignment with your truth, that water flows naturally. But when you live in contradiction, saying things you don't mean, doing things that go against your values, silencing your needs, the flow becomes blocked. You build dams around your authenticity, and the water stagnates. Jung understood that neurosis often stems from this very fragmentation. When the conscious self is at war with the unconscious needs of the soul, that war costs you energy. You're constantly managing internal conflict, navigating guilt, justifying decisions that don't feel right. But the moment you stop betraying yourself, when you start acting in alignment with your inner truth, the dam begins to break. The water moves again. You don't need more energy. You need to stop leaking it through self-denial. Self-betrayal is subtle. It hides in the belief that you're being kind or generous by ignoring your limits. It masquerades as nobility, as being the bigger person, but over time, it erodes your spirit. You start to feel resentful, not just toward others, but toward yourself. You wonder why you're always tired, uninspired, numb. But the answer isn't more sleep or more discipline. It's more truth. When you begin to live in integrity, when your actions reflect your authentic values, not your survival programming, something powerful happens. Energy returns, not just the energy to function, but the energy to create, to connect, to feel deeply again. Jung would call this individuation, the reclaiming of your unique wholeness, and that wholeness is the source of real vitality. The reason many people feel burned out isn't because they're doing too much. It's because they're doing the wrong things for the wrong reasons. Pleasing others to avoid guilt, working to earn love, performing instead of expressing. When you stop betraying yourself, you begin to notice which parts of your life were never really yours. You step out of obligation and into alignment. And as Jung would say, the soul rejoices when it is finally seen and honored. Energy floods back in, not from external motivation, but from the internal peace of no longer living in contradiction. This is not about being selfish, it's about being whole. Because when your inner world and outer actions match, you stop draining yourself through inner conflict. And in that coherence, your energy is no longer scattered. It's focused, alive, free. There is a mysterious magnetism that draws people to someone who lives in alignment with their true self. This magnetism isn't about superficial charm or forced charisma. It is the natural radiance of authenticity. Carl Jung taught that the journey toward individuation, becoming whole by integrating all parts of the psyche, awakens a profound energy that others sense intuitively. When you stop wearing masks and stop playing roles to fit expectations, you begin to emit an invisible frequency. This frequency speaks directly to the unconscious mind of others, inviting genuine connection. It's as if your soul lights up a beacon that calls those who resonate with your truth. This is the power of being aligned with your deepest self. Alignment is the antidote to the exhaustion caused by fragmentation. When your thoughts, feelings, and actions harmonize, your presence becomes magnetic because it's coherent and trustworthy. People unconsciously pick up on this integrity, even if they can't fully explain it. In contrast, when there's inner conflict, when the persona you show is disconnected from the soul beneath, others may sense something is off, even if they can't name it. Jung believed that the psyche's energy flows naturally toward wholeness, and this flow translates into a charismatic presence. You don't have to try harder to be loved or accepted, you simply are. And that being is enough to draw others in, like moths to a flame. This magnetism is not a tool for manipulation, but a reflection of psychological health and spiritual alignment. It is the opposite of the persona's false shine. When you become magnetic through alignment, you are no longer dependent on external validation. Instead, you radiate from a place of inner security and self-acceptance. Jung's concept of the self, the archetype of wholeness, describes this state where the individual is centered, balanced, and authentic. Others feel safe around you because you embody your truth without pretense. This safety encourages vulnerability and deeper relationships. The energy you give off invites others to lower their defenses, creating a space where true connection can flourish. Finally, the magnetism of alignment serves a higher purpose beyond personal charisma. It becomes a light for others on their own journey toward wholeness. When you embody your truth fully, you inspire those around you to confront their shadows and seek their own integration. Jung believed that the process of individuation not only heals the individual, but contributes to the collective unconscious. Your authentic presence is a ripple in the collective sea, encouraging growth and healing on a larger scale. So by putting yourself first in a healthy, integrated way, you don't isolate yourself, you magnetize others toward transformation. This is the paradox of true strength. In being yourself fully, you invite others to do the same. Putting yourself first, in the Jungian sense, is not an act of selfishness. It is an act of profound courage and healing. It demands that you face the fears and shadows that have kept you fragmented and disconnected. But through this journey of integration, you reclaim your power and your peace. You break free from the chains of societal conditioning that taught you to prioritize others at your expense. By honoring your inner voice, you align with your authentic self and awaken a magnetism that no external approval can replicate. This realignment invites healthier relationships, deeper connections, and a life lived with purpose rather than obligation. It is a revolution from within, silent yet seismic, that transforms not only your world, but ripples outward, inspiring others to embark on their own path toward wholeness. Carl Jung's teachings remind us that the self is the ultimate source of strength, healing, and fulfillment. When you dare to put yourself first in this way, you embody true liberation. And in that liberation, you become a beacon of light in a world hungry for authenticity. The journey is neither easy nor quick, but it is the most vital work you will ever undertake. Embrace yourself fully. Choose yourself unapologetically. Because in doing so, you do not just survive, you thrive. You do not just exist, you become truly alive.